I went to the dentist for a toothache. I expected a filling, maybe a root canal at worst. What I didn't expect was my dentist dropping his tools, stepping back from the chair, and saying words that made my blood run cold. "We need to call 911 right now." When he showed me the x-ray, I finally understood why. That routine dental appointment didn't just fix my tooth, it saved my life. My name is Sutton Avery. I'm 26 years old and I work as a graphic designer in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm the kind of person who pushes through pain instead of dealing with it. I ignore headaches. I skip doctor's appointments. I tell myself I'm fine even when I'm clearly not. That stubbornness almost killed me. I have an older sister named Marlo. She's 31 and works as a labor and delivery nurse at the hospital across town. She's been looking out for me my whole life, especially after we lost our mom to breast cancer 7 years ago. Marlo is the one who nags me to take care of myself. She's the one who tells me to stop working so hard and start paying attention to my health. I never listened to her, not until the day everything changed. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love connecting with all of you. Now let me tell you how a simple toothache ended up saving my life. It started about 3 weeks before that dentist appointment. I woke up one morning with a dull ache in my lower jaw on the left side. It wasn't terrible at first, just a small, annoying pain that came and went throughout the day. I figured it was a cavity, or maybe my wisdom teeth finally deciding to cause trouble. I told myself I would make an appointment soon, but I never did. I was busy with work. My design firm had just landed a huge client, and I was responsible for creating their entire brand identity. We're talking logo, website, packaging, social media templates, everything. It was the biggest project of my career, and I was determined to prove myself. So I worked late every night, survived on coffee and takeout, and ignored the pain in my jaw. Marlo noticed something was wrong during our weekly dinner at her apartment. She has this way of looking at me that makes me feel like she can see right through me. We were eating pasta when she suddenly put down her fork and stared at me. She said, "You keep touching your jaw. What's going on?" I shrugged and told her it was nothing. Probably just a cavity. I would get it checked out eventually. She didn't like that answer. She leaned forward and gave me that look, the one that reminded me so much of our mother. She said, "Sutton, eventually isn't good enough. You need to see a dentist. This week." I promised her I would, but deep down, I had no intention of following through. I had too much work to do. I couldn't afford to take time off for something as minor as a toothache, but the pain didn't stay minor. Over the next 2 weeks, it got worse. The dull ache turned into a constant throb that radiated up the side of my face and into my temple. I started getting headaches that wouldn't go away, no matter how much water I drank or how many painkillers I took. Some mornings, I woke up feeling dizzy, like the room was tilting slightly to one side. I blamed it on stress. I blamed it on lack of sleep. I blamed it on staring at computer screens for 14 hours a day. I kept pushing through. That's what I do. That's what I've always done. When our mom was sick, I pushed through. When she died and I had to go back to college 2 weeks later, I pushed through. When my first serious boyfriend broke up with me right after graduation, I pushed through. Pushing through is the only way I know how to survive. But my body was trying to tell me something. It was screaming at me, actually. I just wasn't listening. The night before my dentist appointment, I finally broke. I woke up at 3 in the morning with pain so intense I thought my head was going to explode. My entire left side of my face was on fire. I stumbled to the bathroom, turned on the light, and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red and watery. My skin looked pale and gray. I was sweating even though the house was cold. I stood there gripping the edge of the sink and finally admitted the truth to myself. Something was seriously wrong. This wasn't just a cavity. This wasn't just stress. This was something else entirely, and I needed help. I grabbed my phone and opened the website for my dentist's office. Dr. Rafael Mendez had been my dentist since I moved to Charlotte 4 years ago. He was kind and patient and always remembered details about my life from previous appointments. I found the earliest available slot, which was 8:30 the next morning, and booked it before I could change my mind. Then I crawled back into bed and stared at the ceiling until the sun came up. I couldn't sleep. The pain was too intense. But more than that, I was scared. I kept thinking about my mother and all the appointments that started out routine but ended with devastating news. I kept thinking about Marlo sitting beside me in hospital waiting rooms, holding my hand while doctors explained things I didn't want to hear. I told myself I was being dramatic. It was just a toothache. People got toothaches all the time. I would go to the dentist, he would find a cavity, I would get it filled, and everything would be fine. There was no reason to panic, but somewhere deep inside me, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I knew this was different. I could feel it in my bones. Something was very wrong, and I was about to find out just how wrong it really was. The next morning, I got dressed slowly, my hands trembling as I buttoned my shirt. I skipped breakfast because my stomach was too twisted with nerves to eat anything. I drove to the dentist's office in silence, not even turning on the radio. The streets were quiet that early in the morning, and the whole world felt strangely still, like it was holding its breath. When I pulled into the parking lot of the dental office, I sat in my car for a few minutes before going inside. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror and took a deep breath. I told myself everything was going to be okay. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself this was just a normal Wednesday morning and a normal dental appointment, and there was absolutely nothing to worry about. I had no idea that in less than an hour, my entire life would change forever. The waiting room was exactly what you would expect from a dentist's office. Soft music playing from hidden speakers, magazines spread across a coffee table that nobody ever actually read, a television mounted on the wall showing the morning news with the volume turned low. There were 2 other patients waiting when I walked in, both of them scrolling through their phones without looking up. I signed in at the front desk and filled out the standard paperwork: medical history, current medications, reason for visit. I wrote down jaw pain and headaches and handed the clipboard back to the receptionist. She smiled and told me Dr. Mendez would be with me shortly. I sat down in one of the padded chairs and tried to calm my racing heart. My phone buzzed with a text from Marlo. She wrote, "Good luck at the dentist. Call me after and let me know what they say. Love you." I typed back a quick reply telling her I would, and then shoved my phone into my purse. I didn't want to talk to anyone right now. I just wanted to get this over with. A dental hygienist called my name about 10 minutes later. Her name tag said Brianna, and she had a warm smile that put me slightly at ease. She led me down a hallway lined with doors and into a small examination room with a large chair in the center. The chair was reclined slightly, and there was a bright light positioned above it. A tray of dental tools sat on a counter nearby, all of them shiny and sterile. Brianna asked me to sit down and lean back. She draped a paper bib across my chest and asked me to describe my symptoms. I told her about the jaw pain that had been getting worse for 3 weeks. I told her about the headaches that wouldn't go away. I mentioned the dizziness but said I thought it was probably just stress from work. She nodded and typed everything into a computer. She said they would start with some x-rays to get a better look at what was going on. She positioned a heavy lead apron over my chest and placed a small plastic device in my mouth. She told me to bite down and hold still. The machine made a clicking sound, and then she moved it to a different angle and did it again. After that, she brought over a larger machine that wrapped around my head for what she called a panoramic X-ray. She said it would give them a complete picture of my jaw, teeth, and surrounding structures. I sat alone in the examination room while she went to process the images. The minutes felt like hours. I stared at the ceiling tiles and counted them one by one. I listened to the muffled sounds of conversations happening in other rooms. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, and I would be out of here soon, with nothing more than a prescription for antibiotics. When the door finally opened, it wasn't Brianna who walked in. It was Dr. Mendez. He was a man in his mid-50s with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-framed glasses. He usually greeted me with a smile and asked about my work or my sister or whatever we had talked about during my last visit. But today he didn't smile. His expression was serious, and he was holding the X-ray in his hand like it weighed 100 pounds. He sat down on the rolling stool beside my chair and moved closer to me. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't concern exactly. It was something deeper than that. Something that made my stomach drop. He spoke slowly and carefully. He said, "Sutton, I need to ask you some questions before we go any further. Have you been experiencing any headaches recently?" I told him yes, almost every day for the past few weeks. He nodded and asked if I had been feeling dizzy or lightheaded. I said yes to that too. I assumed it was because I wasn't sleeping well. He asked if I had noticed any changes in my vision, blurry spots, flashes of light, anything unusual. I thought about it for a moment. There had been a few times when my vision seemed slightly off, like I was looking through a dirty window. I told him about it, and his expression grew even more serious. He stood up from the stool and removed his latex gloves. He set them down on the counter and turned back to face me. His voice was calm, but firm when he spoke. He said, "Sutton, I need you to stay very calm right now. We need to call 911 immediately." I felt like someone had punched me in the chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I opened my mouth to ask what was happening, but no words came out. He picked up the X-ray and held it up to the light so I could see it. He pointed to an area near the top of the image, far above my teeth, in a region I didn't even know a dental X-ray could capture. There was a dark shadow there, something that clearly didn't belong. He said, "This shadow right here. This is not supposed to be there. I'm not a neurologist, but I've seen enough in my career to know that this needs immediate attention. I'm not going to let you walk out of this office without getting you to a hospital." I stared at the shadow on the X-ray, and my whole world started spinning. This wasn't a cavity. This wasn't a wisdom tooth problem. This was something in my head, something growing near my brain, something that could kill me. I couldn't stop staring at that shadow on the X-ray. It was small, maybe the size of a grape, but it looked monstrous to me. It looked like a death sentence. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to grip the armrests of the dental chair just to keep them still. My mind was racing through 1,000 different scenarios, and none of them were good. Dr. Mendez must have seen the panic in my eyes because he put his hand on my shoulder and spoke in a calm, steady voice. He said, "Sutton, I know this is terrifying, but I need you to breathe. We don't know exactly what this is yet. It could be many things. What I do know is that we caught it, and that's what matters right now. The best thing we can do is get you to someone who can tell us exactly what we're dealing with." I nodded, but I wasn't really listening. My brain was stuck on one thought that kept repeating over and over. This is how it started with Mom. A routine appointment, an unexpected finding, a shadow on a scan that changed everything. I watched her fight for 3 years before the cancer finally won. I held her hand in the hospital room when she took her last breath, and now here I was, sitting in a dentist's chair, looking at my own shadow. Dr. Mendez stepped out of the room to speak with his receptionist. I could hear him through the door, his voice low and urgent. He was telling her to call 911 and explain the situation. He was telling her to clear his schedule for the rest of the morning. He was telling her to bring me some water because I looked like I was about to pass out. The receptionist came in a moment later with a small paper cup filled with cold water. She handed it to me with a sympathetic smile and told me everything was going to be okay. I wanted to believe her. I really did, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my life was falling apart right in front of me. I asked Dr. Mendez if I could call my sister before the ambulance arrived. He handed me his office phone without hesitation. My own phone was buried somewhere in my purse, and my hands were trembling too much to dig through it. I dialed Marlo's number from memory and pressed the phone to my ear. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was bright and cheerful, completely unaware of what was happening. She said, "Hey, that was fast. Are you done already? What did he say?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words got stuck in my throat. I tried to speak, but all that came out was a choked sob. I pressed my hand over my mouth and squeezed my eyes shut, trying to hold myself together. Marlo's voice changed instantly. The cheerfulness disappeared, replaced by sharp concern. She said, "Sutton, what's wrong? Talk to me. What's happening?" I managed to get out a few broken sentences. I told her I was still at the dentist. I told her something was wrong. I told her they were calling an ambulance. She didn't ask any more questions. She didn't demand explanations. She just said, "I'm coming right now. Don't move. I'll be there in 15 minutes." The line went dead, and I handed the phone back to Dr. Mendez. He was standing by the door, watching me with a mixture of concern and compassion. He told me the ambulance was on its way and should arrive within 10 minutes. He said he would stay with me until they got here. Those 10 minutes felt like an eternity. I sat in that dental chair staring at the ceiling, trying to process what was happening. I thought about all the things I had been putting off, the trips I wanted to take, the friends I kept meaning to call but never did, the conversations I avoided because they felt too difficult. I thought about Marlo and how she had been begging me to take better care of myself for years. I thought about my mother and the promise I made at her funeral to live my life fully and without regret. I had broken that promise. I had spent the past 7 years burying myself in work and avoiding anything that made me feel vulnerable. I skipped vacations. I canceled plans with friends. I ignored every warning sign my body tried to give me because I was too stubborn and too scared to slow down. The sound of sirens in the distance pulled me out of my thoughts. They grew louder and louder until they stopped right outside the building. A moment later, 2 paramedics walked through the door with a stretcher between them. They were calm and professional, asking me questions about my symptoms while they checked my vitals. One of them wrapped a blood pressure cuff around my arm, while the other shined a small light into my eyes. They helped me onto the stretcher and strapped me in. I looked up at the ceiling as they wheeled me down the hallway and out the front door of the dental office. The morning sun was bright and warm on my face, and for a moment, I closed my eyes and let myself feel it. I didn't know what was going to happen next. I didn't know if I was going to live or die, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to face this alone. Just as they were loading me into the ambulance, I heard a car screech into the parking lot. A door slammed, and then I heard footsteps running toward me. I turned my head and saw Marlo sprinting across the pavement, her face pale with fear. She reached the ambulance just as the paramedics were about to close the doors. She grabbed my hand and said, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The ambulance ride felt like it lasted forever. Marlo sat beside me the whole time, holding my hand so tightly I could feel her pulse against my fingers. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. One of the paramedics was asking me questions about my medical history, but I could barely focus on his words. My mind kept drifting back to that shadow on the X-ray, that dark spot hiding inside my head, like a secret waiting to be discovered. When we arrived at Charlotte Medical Center, everything moved fast. The paramedics wheeled me through the emergency room doors and into a bright hallway filled with nurses and doctors in scrubs. Someone was calling out instructions. Someone else was attaching wires to my chest to monitor my heart. A nurse inserted an IV into my arm and told me they were going to run some tests. Marlo had to wait outside while they took me for scans. She kissed my forehead before they wheeled me away and told me she would be right there when I came back. I watched her face disappear as the doors swung closed behind me, and I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. They started with a CT scan. I lay perfectly still on a narrow table while the machine hummed and clicked around me. The technician spoke to me through a speaker, telling me when to hold my breath and when to relax. After that, they took me for an MRI. The machine was louder than I expected, a rhythmic banging that echoed through my skull. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine I was somewhere else. A beach, a forest, anywhere but here. When the tests were finished, they brought me back to a small room in the emergency department. Marlo was already there, sitting in a plastic chair with her coat still on. She jumped up when she saw me and rushed to my side. She asked if I was okay, if it hurt, if they told me anything yet. I shook my head. Nobody had told me anything. We were still waiting. The next 2 hours were the longest of my life. Marlo tried to distract me by talking about random things, her patients at work, a new restaurant she wanted to try, a show she had been watching on Netflix. I appreciated the effort, but I couldn't focus on any of it. I just kept staring at the door, waiting for someone to walk through and tell me my fate. Finally, a knock came. The door opened, and a woman in a white coat stepped inside. She introduced herself as Dr. Keisha Thornton, a neurosurgeon. She was tall, with short gray hair and a calm, steady presence that immediately put me at ease. She pulled a rolling stool closer to my bed and sat down so we were at eye level. She said, "Sutton, I've reviewed your scans, and I want to walk you through what we found." She turned a computer monitor toward me and pulled up an image of my brain. It looked strange and unfamiliar, all gray and white shapes that I couldn't make sense of. But Dr. Thornton pointed to a specific area near the base of my skull, and suddenly I could see it, a small, dark circle that didn't match anything around it. She explained that it was an aneurysm, a weak spot in one of the blood vessels in my brain that had started to bulge outward like a tiny balloon. She said it had probably been growing slowly for months, maybe even years. The headaches, the dizziness, the jaw pain that drove me to the dentist in the first place were all symptoms of pressure building inside my skull. She paused and looked at me with serious eyes. She said, "Sutton, I want to be honest with you. This aneurysm is in a dangerous location. If it ruptures, you could have a massive stroke. The survival rate for that kind of event is very low. We're talking about minutes, not hours." I felt Marlowe's grip tighten on my hand. I heard her breath catch in her throat. My own heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. Dr. Thornton continued. She said the good news was that we found it before it ruptured. She said there was a procedure they could do to fix it. It was called endovascular coiling. A surgeon would thread a tiny tube through my blood vessels and place small metal coils inside the aneurysm to seal it off. It was delicate and risky, but it could save my life. She asked if I had any questions. I had a million, but only one came out of my mouth. I asked her what would have happened if I hadn't gone to the dentist that morning. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. She said, "Based on the size and location of this aneurysm, I estimate you had less than a week before it ruptured on its own. If your dentist hadn't caught this on that X-ray, you probably wouldn't be here right now." I felt tears streaming down my face, but I didn't bother wiping them away. Marlowe was crying too, her shoulders shaking as she pressed her forehead against my hand. They scheduled the surgery for the next morning. I spent that night lying awake in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything I still wanted to do with my life. Marlowe slept in the chair beside me, refusing to leave even when the nurses offered to bring her a cot. Every time I looked at her, I felt a wave of gratitude so strong it almost hurt. The next morning, they came to take me to the operating room. Marlowe walked beside the stretcher until we reached the doors she couldn't pass through. She leaned down and kissed my cheek. She told me she loved me. She told me she would be waiting right there when I woke up. The last thing I saw before the anesthesia pulled me under was the bright light of the operating room ceiling. And the last thing I thought was a prayer. "Please, let me wake up." The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the pain. It felt like someone had taken a hammer to the inside of my skull and decided to leave it there. My eyes were heavy, and it took all my strength just to open them. The room was bright and blurry, and for a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then I heard a voice I recognized. Marlowe. She was standing beside my bed, holding my hand just like she promised. When she saw my eyes open, her face crumpled with relief. Tears started streaming down her cheeks, and she leaned forward to press her forehead against mine. She whispered that I was okay. She whispered that the surgery worked. She whispered that I was going to live. I spent the next 3 days in the intensive care unit. The doctors monitored me constantly, checking my vitals every few hours and asking me questions to make sure my brain was functioning properly. They asked me my name, the date, the name of the president. I answered everything correctly, and each time I did, I saw the relief on their faces. Dr. Thornton came to see me on the second day. She sat down beside my bed and told me the surgery had been a complete success. The aneurysm was sealed, and the risk of rupture had been eliminated. She said I would need to take it easy for a few weeks and come back for regular checkups, but there was no reason I couldn't live a completely normal life from now on. I asked her how this happened. I asked her why a 26-year-old with no family history of brain problems had developed an aneurysm. She said sometimes there was no clear answer. Sometimes these things just happened. But she also said that my body had been sending me warning signs for weeks. The headaches, the dizziness, the jaw pain. If I had listened sooner, we might have caught it even earlier. A week after my surgery, I went back to Dr. Mendez's office. I didn't have an appointment. I just needed to see him. I needed to thank him for what he did. I brought a bouquet of sunflowers and a card that I had spent hours writing. The words felt inadequate for what I wanted to say, but I did my best. When he saw me walk through the door, his face lit up. He came around the reception desk and pulled me into a hug. He told me he had been thinking about me every day since the ambulance took me away. He told me he called the hospital to check on my progress, but couldn't get any information because he wasn't family. I handed him the flowers and the card. He read it right there in the waiting room, and I saw his eyes get misty behind his glasses. The card said, "You didn't just fix my tooth. You saved my life. I will never be able to thank you enough." He looked at me and said something I will never forget. He said, "Sutton, in 30 years of dentistry, I have never seen anything like what happened with you. When I looked at that X-ray, something told me to look closer. Something told me not to ignore that shadow. I believe you were meant to walk into my office that day, and I believe someone was watching over you." I thought about my mother when he said that. I thought about all the times I had felt her presence since she passed away. The moments when I smelled her perfume out of nowhere. The dreams where she came to me and told me everything would be okay. Maybe she was the one who made my jaw hurt bad enough to finally make an appointment. Maybe she was the one who guided Dr. Mendez to look at that X-ray a little more carefully. I will never know for sure, but I choose to believe she had something to do with it. My relationship with Marlo changed after that experience. We had always been close, but now we were inseparable. We stopped putting off the things that mattered. We booked that trip to Portugal we had been talking about for years. We started having dinner together twice a week instead of once. We called each other every single morning, not because we had to, but because we wanted to. I quit my job at the design firm 2 months after my surgery. The stress and the long hours weren't worth it anymore. I started my own freelance business and began taking on projects that actually excited me. I worked fewer hours and spent more time doing the things I loved. I went hiking on weekends. I learned to cook new recipes. I adopted a cat named Biscuit who sleeps on my chest every night. Most importantly, I stopped ignoring my body. I stopped pushing through pain and pretending I was fine when I wasn't. I started going to the doctor when something felt wrong, even if it scared me. I learned that taking care of yourself isn't weakness. It's survival. I think about that morning at the dentist's office all the time. I think about how close I came to dying without ever knowing anything was wrong. I think about all the people who ignore their symptoms because they're too busy or too scared or too stubborn to get help. I was one of those people, and I almost paid the ultimate price. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Listen to your body. Don't ignore the warning signs. Don't put off the appointments that could save your life. And never ever assume that a small pain isn't worth checking out. Because sometimes the thing that saves you isn't a dramatic intervention or a miracle surgery. Sometimes it's a routine X-ray at a dentist's office that catches something nobody was even looking for. I went in for a toothache. I came out with a second chance at life, and I'm going to spend every single day making sure I deserve it. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe to my channel and leave a comment telling me if you've ever ignored a symptom that turned out to be something serious. I read every single comment, and your story might help someone else.